My first guest is going to be author Bryan Gruley. Bryan is here to talk about his new book, The Hanging Tree, but as background, he's Chicago bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal and shared in the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the September 11th terrorist attacks. His debut novel, Starvation Lake, was winner of the Strand Magazine Critics Award for Best First Novel and was also nominated for an Edgar Award, 2 Anthony Awards, and a Barry Award. And we'll talk about what all of those are. He's an avid hockey player and musician, and he lives with his wife, Pam, in Chicago. So, Bryan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Jacqueline.
Well, this is an interesting novel, and we're going to talk about how things developed. And it is from Touchstone, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, and it's out now. It's a trade paperback, but Bryan's got an interesting story, and we're going to get into all of that with him. But first of all, Bryan, why don't you give us all an overview of the story of The Hanging Tree?
The Hanging Tree is the sequel to my debut novel, which was called Starvation Lake, and is set in the same fictional town of Starvation Lake in northern lower Michigan. Some people think it's in the upper peninsula, but it's actually in the lower, where it gets pretty cold and snowy, too.
Okay.
And in this little town, in the Hanging Tree, in the beginning of the book, a woman in her 30s, is found hanging dead in a shoe tree just outside of town. And Michiganders will be familiar with shoe trees. They're not the things you put in your shoes to preserve them. A shoe tree up there is a tree that's been filled with pairs of shoes with people who've thrown them up there for a variety of reasons. You know, maybe they're lovers, maybe it's a high school graduation, maybe they've had too much to drink, whatever. And there's actually a tree in northern Michigan that I've driven past many times that inspired this.
How about that?
Beginning of the book, a woman, her name is Gracie McBride, is found hanging in this tree on apparent suicide. And figuring out whether it really was a suicide or something more nefarious falls to our narrator and protagonist, Gus Carpenter, executive editor of the little paper in Starvation.
Well, and you mentioned that it is a sequel to your original story, but the collection didn't start out as a series, did it? How did it develop into a series?
Well, I wrote one book, Starvation Lake, which is about the death of a hockey coach in that little town, and my agent submitted it in April of '06. And it took about a year, 26 rejections from various publishers, before Touchstone bought it and said, we'd like you to write 2 additional Starvation Lake books, and who knows, maybe more after that. But
you must have just about fallen off your seat when you heard that.
I did, yeah. Actually, it was the same day that the billionaire Rupert Murdoch and his company, News Corp, made a bid for my company, Dow Jones, which owns the Wall Street Journal. So it was an unsettling day, and my agent called me, and we talked for 5 or 10 minutes about Rupert Murdoch, and then she said, well, would you feel better if I told you I sold Starvation Lake, and it's a 3-book contract? And I thought, boy, you're kind of burying the lead here, aren't you?
Yeah, that is really something. And you know, I'm sure as a writer, 26 rejections sound like a lot to you, but it really isn't. For you to even hit after 26 rejections, I think a lot of writers will tell you is pretty darn good. Now, I thought what was fun is that you've talked about how writing a sequel differs from writing your debut novel, and I like your answer, so why don't you tell the listeners what your response is to the difference?
Well, it's similar in this way, Jacqueline. When I wrote my debut novel, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I'd never written a novel before. And then when I wrote a sequel, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I'd never written a sequel before. And the reason it's trickier is there's a certain trick to it, is when you're writing a sequel, it needs, and I made every effort to make The Hanging Tree stand on its own, so that people don't feel like they need to read the first book
Yes,
to
and
read the second.
that's what was great when I was reading it, because I must admit I haven't read your first book, but now I'm going to go back and read your first book.
Terrific.
And it did stand on its own, so that was
Thank
great.
you. Thanks. But at the same time, for readers who have read the first book, you don't want to put in so much history and backstory that they get bored rereading what they already knew.
Yeah.
So there's this tricky balance there, and, of course, I try to manage it myself. But, I had readers who had read the earlier book and an editor who had, and they help with that as well.
Yeah, well,
So it's just enough, but not too much.
Well, your honesty was really terrific, because I don't know how many writers would really have said what you said, that you didn't know what you were doing. I think you did know what you were doing. It's obvious, but
sometimes I feel like I'm groping in the dark. And,
I'm wondering if all writers don't feel the same way, though. I interview writers, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I think every writer has their inner feelings about certain things.
Right.
I thought it was fun that you mentioned also that you were criticized in your writing of the debut novel, and critics complained, you said, about the hockey description, dialogue, as well as the way your hair looked in the photo. Now, is that true? Did somebody really complain about the way your hair looked?
Somebody did. I totally forgotten that, Jacqueline, but when you mentioned it, I remember, because it was a source of some mirth here in my household, my wife and kids. And, somebody complained about the hair.
Well,
and there for the most part, people really like the hockey in the book, even people who are not fans. Even people who aren't sports fans, because I didn't just throw it in there because I like hockey. It becomes integral to some of the characters and the way they behave and the decisions they make. That said, the second book, The Hanging... I was talking about Starvation Lake there.
Right.
The Hanging Tree has quite a bit less on-ice hockey, but there is a subplot about a rich gentleman who moves to Starvation Lake with his family, including a son who's a very good hockey goaltender. And he tells the town, I'm going to build you a new rink, and with that new rink and my son, we're going to win a state championship here in Starvation Lake, which is a big, big deal there. And he doesn't really have the money for it, so that introduces some tension into the book.
Mm-hmm.
But, what I would say is, hockey to Starvation Lake is like anything to small towns, and I've done a lot of reporting on them over the years as a newspaper reporter. Most small towns have something that knits them together, whether it's oil or basketball or strawberries or ethanol or football. There's something that gives the town purpose and meaning, and that they celebrate when it's doing well and mourn when it's not. And in Starvation Lake, that happens to be hockey.
Right. You won a Pulitzer Prize, and by the way, congratulations on that, particularly a Pulitzer Prize for your work on September 11th.
Well, it was a cast of hundreds, Jacqueline. I shared it, and I'm proud of it because it was a very big day.
Yes, it was. I wonder, I'd like to get your, your opinion on what's happening now with the decline in the printed word in newspapers. The number of pages are getting shorter and shorter.
Right.
And I've been interviewing a lot of journalists who have written books. Now, you said that you're not optimistic about the future of print because your quote is, the business model is broken beyond repair. And I'd like to know, and I know my listeners, our listeners, would be interested in knowing what you mean by that. And did that actually affect your decision to start writing novels?
Well, by business model being broken, I mean, for more than 100 years, newspapers have run on a pretty simple business model. We essentially give the paper away, 25 cents or 30 cents. It doesn't even pay for the paper and the ink and the salaries of people who work there. We give it away, but then we get all these subscribers, and we assemble them, and then we, in effect, sell them to advertisers. And advertisers pay our bills and make us money.
Sure.
A lot of money in many cases. And the Internet has broken down not only, well, it's broken down our ability to assemble subscribers because they can get it for free.
Absolutely.
Or they think they're getting it. They are getting it for free, but what's happening now as a result of that is the infrastructure of reporters, editors, photographers, graphics people, etc., who organize information into digestible bits and bytes, shorter and longer. That infrastructure is breaking down. And I don't think print, there'll be print papers in 10 years, but I think they'll be more of a luxury because they'll be expensive for people to buy. Most people will get their news online. What I think is important for the country is, and I hope this transpires, is that we have organizations of people big enough that they can embrace many different topics, because most of the things that matter to people are connected to other things. Education is connected to budgets, which is connected to politics, which is connected to the economy. And having big groups of people who can make sense of these interconnected things, I think is beneficial. But in the end, it'll be what people want, and I think smart people will go look for the smartest people who can tell them things they didn't know 5 seconds ago and make sense of a very complicated world. And, there's going to be a lot of blood spilled before we get there. But
I'm sure.
There's a lot of demand for that.
Yeah, and
the problem is on the supply side of the equation, and there's some people are going to get very rich if they figure that out.
Well, I'm going to remember that prediction of yours, and
okay.
We'll see how that all comes together. Well, the second part of the question was, did that
inspire? Not really. No, not at all. In fact, when I started the book, newspapers were in their last great boom years in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, before the first internet bust. And they were just dump trucks of money were being shoveled in to newspapers then, particularly my newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. I've always wanted to write novels since I was a little kid. But I got out of Notre Dame in 1979 and found out you couldn't just sit around. People will pay you to make things up. So I went into newspapers because I wanted to write, and I sort of learned the other part of the trade, reporting, over the years.
Yeah.
And it was a great ride, but all along I still had this sort of yearning that I wanted to write novels. And so I finally took a crack, and I wrote part of one, and my agent didn't like it. And we were talking about it one day, and she said, why don't you write me a story about these middle-aged guys who play hockey in the middle of the night?
Oh.
And I had an idea
about that,
which I won't share with you, the idea, because it would spoil Starvation Lake.
Right.
4 years later, I finished my first novel.
Well, and your fellow Chicagoan wrote the story about Capone. Did you?
Right, John Ide, who's a good friend of mine.
Yes, I interviewed him. It was an interesting interview as well, and the fact it's a fellow journalist, I think, is interesting.
Yeah, he and I worked together at
How about
He
that?
worked for me, actually.
Is that right?
And John and I, he lives about 6 blocks from me.
Isn't that something?
He and I go back and forth. I read his early manuscripts of his books, and he reads my early manuscript. In fact, he has the first 6 chapters. Right, and as we speak, I just gave it to him the other day. First 6 chapters of Book 3 of Starvation Lake, and
that's a great partnership.
Yeah, he's a great guy,
yeah.
And a very good, talented writer and reporter.
Did you find that your background as a journalist did help you in putting the mystery together in the first novel in particular, and in the continuation?
Undoubtedly. I mean, partly because the main character is a journalist. Works at a little paper, and I've worked at little papers, and I've known many, many, many journalists over the years, so that helped me render the character.
I want to ask you about the fact that your first novel, Starvation Lake, was nominated for several awards, as I mentioned in the introduction,
right,
including the prestigious Edgar. And I wondered, how did all of those nominations affect you personally? And did it affect your writing in any way on your next book?
I was delighted to be nominated for the Edgar. I didn't win. I'm delighted to be nominated for a couple of Anthonys and a Barry, and we'll find out about those in October.
Good.
I mean, they're fun. It's fun to be nominated for awards, but I've been through the award thing many times, nominated and lose or nominated and win in journalism. And it's nice if you win. It's nice to be nominated, but you can't really think about it if you don't. You go on.
Right.
I don't think it's affected my writing at all.
Okay.
It's nice, and it draws attention to the books.
Now, talking about your writing, most writers' process in the act of writing begins with an idea. Did you you got the idea an idea for an aspect of it, as you said, when you saw an actual hanging tree. But overall, did you then go on to develop the plot, the character, the setting that got it started, or how was your process working at that point?
Well, because it was a sequel, I had a pretty good idea of what the setting was and what some of the main characters were, because they carry over to the second book. But as far as the plot goes, I knew where it began, with a woman hanging in a tree, and I had a vague idea of where it ended, which I won't share, obviously, because I don't want to spoil it.
Right.
And then I just start writing.
Okay.
And the plot sort of does its twists and turns before me as I go. And then I do a lot of revising and get things into shape so that it's not too crazy.
And did it happen the same way with your first novel, or was that a different process?
Well, I tried my first novel. Remember, I said I didn't know what the heck I was doing.
That's right.
I tried doing an outline, and the characters just, they wouldn't be outlined. So I did my best, but generally it's more the process of writing actually becomes a process of discovery for me, Jacqueline.
Mm-hmm. Well, in talking about characters, I think this would be a good time to talk about your character of Gracie McBride, who is certainly a very significant character, and that's where the whole story starts, with
right.
Gracie McBride. So talk a little bit about her.
Sure. It's unusual in that you start with a character who's dead. And so you learn about her only through flashbacks and mostly through the eyes of Gus Carpenter, who's the narrator, and it happens to be Gracie's second cousin, a sort of sibling, because she spent a lot of time at Gus's house when she was a kid. She came from a home where her father had died when she was young. Her mother wasn't a very good mother, and Gracie has lived a really difficult life, a difficult person to love and like. And when she ends up in this tree, Gus thinks, well, of course she ends up in the tree. That's where she was headed her whole life. And how I tried to render Gracie was not to resurrect her as some sort of saint after she died, but merely to have people see her as a human being like most of us, with foibles and flaws, struggling to get through the day and make the right decisions. She made a lot of bad ones. In the very end, she was trying to make a good one or two, and in the end, I really loved Gracie.
I've heard many authors say that about characters, how they really do just love them so much that they're sad when the story's over. I think that's the same with a reader. When you really get into a story, you develop affection for a character because it's real within your imagination, and I can only imagine you did create the character, so I'm sure you did feel that way.
Yeah, I think John Updike used to say he could never kill off his characters because he liked them too much. and here I start by Gracie doesn't even get a chance. The first time she appears, she's hanging in a tree dead. Poor Gracie. So,
now,
but I loved her backwards there.
Yeah. Were you raised in Michigan?
Yes, I was born and raised in the in and around Detroit, but my parents bought a place, a lake house, in northern Lower Michigan when I was 13 years old.
So you spent a lot of time in a place like exists in your story, and did that inspire the setting for your books? And
yes.
And you are a hockey player yourself, so did you use yourself as the model of the hockey playing?
No, not
character?
really, because Gus is a goaltender, and I'm not a goalie.
Oh,
but I've known a lot of goalies, and they're all off by a degree or so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, well, you stand between two pipes and let people fire pucks at you at 80 miles an hour. have something.
That is a little bizarre. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah,
I love hockey. I love hockey games.
Great.
Oh, yeah.
I love it, too. I still play.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more popular back east, really. I think hockey is the game that people back east are more familiar with, and kids getting out on the ice and all of that.
It's difficult to watch on television.
It is.
But people who go to games immediately fall in love with it.
Oh,
it's really
yeah.
easy to watch there. It's easy to see everything, and it's so fast and exciting.
Well, it is. And I was a little girl when my dad took me to my first hockey game, and then that became kind of, in hockey season, that became kind of, we went at least every couple of weeks, and you do get hooked by it.
Wow.
So since you mentioned the character Gus, why don't you talk a little bit about him?
Sure. Gus was born and raised in Starvation Lake, this little town. Lost his own father when he was young, and became the goalie for the River Rats, the local team, which was a great, great team when Gus played for it. And in his senior year of high school, the Rats almost won the state title, but Gus gave up a goal in overtime that he probably shouldn't have given up, and became a goat of sorts in town, something he had to live down. And he left town and became a big city journalist in Detroit, became quite a star there, and then committed an egregious ethical error that forced him out of there. He got fired, and he had to go back home. And when the first book opens, he is just recently back home, and he is working at the Pine County Pilot, living in a little apartment over the newsroom, and helping take care of his mom, who lives on Starvation Lake.
You have also said that that you, as far as Gus is concerned, you feel that it's his voice more than anything that connects with certain readers.
Yes.
What made you say that? Have people actually said that to you, or?
Yes. Well, whenever you read a first-person story told in the first person, I think you need to be able to empathize with the character. You don't have to love the person, but if you don't like them, it's really hard to, why listen to somebody? Because it's like somebody talking to you. So why listen to somebody you don't like? And so Gus is a very flawed guy. He can be dense at times. He has an enormous power of denial. But he's a good guy, and he's trying to do the right thing most of the time. And, how can you not like a guy? He drinks Pabst Blue Ribbon. He loves his mother. He really loves his mother. You see that throughout the book. So, both books.
I thought of that when I read that in the book. I got family that drink Pabst.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much part of his character, isn't it?
He's a regular guy,
Yeah.
He's got issues.
You also talk about Augustus Carpenter, that you really thought you got to know Augustus Carpenter. Talk about
Gus.
Augustus.
Right. That's Gus. That's his real name. Augustus James Carpenter. He was named for a guy who appeared in a story in Kalamazoo like 30 years ago.
Well, was he a totally different person? Augustus, you get the feeling for a whole other kind of guy than a Gus.
That's why we call him Gus.
Yeah.
In the book. I'll tell you the story. When I worked at the Kalamazoo Gazette in the early 80s, and I heard a story about an editor there who had written a story when he was a young reporter about a Green Beret, a highly decorated Army war hero. He wrote this feature story and then discovered a few days later that this Green Beret had made the whole thing up.
Oh, my.
And the Green Beret's name was Augustus Carpenter.
Oh,
and
wow.
I heard this story way back then, Jacqueline. I was, 23 years old or something. And when I heard that tale, I said, when I write my first novel, I'm going to name the main character Augustus Carpenter.
Wow.
But as you rightly say, Augustus just doesn't fit. So that's his that's his fancy name on his birth certificate, but he goes by Gus.
Okay. That explains it all.
Good. Thank you.
Now, we do know that there's another book in the series, and
working on it
and you are working on it. Yes, you mentioned before we started also that you are working on it, and when is it going to be finished?
Let's see, what can
What's
I
your
say that won't
deadline?
get
Well,
my
do you have a
publisher?
deadline? I guess
my
that would be.
technical deadline is next April, but I'm going to try to finish it by the end of the year. And that means it would come out next fall of 2011. It's called The Skeleton Box, and it involves the long-ago disappearance of a nun in a church in Starvation Lake.
But it's still related to the first two books,
Oh, it's
right?
set in
Because it is
Starvation
part of the
Lake,
series.
It's a year after The Hanging Tree, and Gus is our friendly narrator.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How are you going to feel when that series ends?
Well, I hope I feel a good sense of accomplishment. We'll see how this third book comes out. And then I don't know if I'm going to continue with this series now or set it aside and do something else. To some degree, it depends on whether another publisher or my publisher, who've been terrific to me at Touchstone, somebody wants to pick me up, because after the third book, my contract's up.
Right.
So I'll be a quote-unquote free agent. But
so you're still kind of thinking about that
when I come to it.
Yeah. It would seem that have you done a lot of investigative journalism in murders and stuff like that?
Oh, no, I haven't written much about cops and crime and stuff.
Okay.
A little bit, but the investigative journalism I've done had more to do with business and public policy stuff, rather than, homicides and break-ins and stuff.
Sounds like there can be an interesting story there. I mean, it's there's a lot of crooks in corporate that you hear
Perish the
about.
thought, Jacqueline.
No, I'm sure that wouldn't be fun for you to do. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your involvement in hockey and its importance to these small communities and that kind of thing. Could you just talk about what it feels like to be in an area where kids hockey is so important as it is in kids football?
Oh, sure. I mean, I grew up in Detroit, where you have some of the best amateur hockey teams in North America, in CompuWare, Little Caesars, Honey Baked Hams. These are all teams sponsored by corporations. And kids come from all over North America and Europe to play in the Detroit area. So
that's amazing.
It's in the blood there. And
Yes.
I had a rink in my backyard, and there was a rink in the backyard next door, and one down the street. And I was never a very good player, but I sure love to play, and I still play. And I play here in Chicago, which is a great hockey town itself. Just the team here won the Stanley Cup this year.
Yes.
And once a year I go up to New Brunswick in Canada and play in an outdoor pond hockey tournament, which is a blast. So for me, it's just a game that has given me some of my best friends, going all the way back to high school, in fact, into grade school. And,
yeah. So it's in everybody's blood. That's
for
sure.
Well, certainly there in Detroit. And then, there's certainly small towns, some of them in northern Michigan, and certainly in Minnesota and Massachusetts. It's huge.
Yeah. I also want to mention the fact, too, that, Brian, you've been on this tour with breaks in between, but you've done a lot of appearances, and you're going to continue to do a lot of appearances. And for those people that are just tuning in, I am talking to Bryan Gruley about his new book, The Hanging Tree. And if you folks are on the way home, you can catch the show live on our website, kptr1450.com. And also you can follow what Brian's doing. And Brian, having said that, I have to say goodbye. We are out of time. I want you to come back when you've finished your next book. Will you do that?
I'd love to come back. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Questions.
And thank you for being here. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show. We'll be right back with my next guest.